The sky burned with fire and metal as the shells rained down from orbit, and the wind carried with it the stench of death and ash and ozone. And far below the broken sky, he ran, with nothing but the weight of her blood and the screams of dying men behind him. And she was so light, so cold, so still in his arms. Her silver skin cracked from the blast, her breath a whisper he could barely hear. And yet she clung to life as if the stars would mourn her should she fall. And he did not know her name, not yet, but he knew her face from every wanted poster, from every military briefing. She was the ruler of their enemies, the leader of the Veirathi, the last creature any human should touch. But she had looked up at him with eyes full of pain and trust, and he could not leave her there to die in the dust. He moved like a ghost through firelight shadows, the battlefield stretching out in ruin behind him, the ground trembling with distant artillery, and the queen in his arms shuddered with each thunderclap, her chest barely rising, and he wrapped his tattered coat around her, though it could not shield her from the poison wind or the judgment of any patrols they might cross. And still he walked, every step a choice, every mile another betrayal of his side, and the weight of her head on his shoulder grew heavier with each heartbeat, not because she weighed much, but because she mattered more than he could admit even to himself. And when her lips parted to whisper something, he leaned close and heard her ask if he was her death, and he said no, though maybe he should have said yes, because she had always been the reason for this war, and yet now he was her only chance of surviving it. The city had been beautiful once, he could tell from the broken arches and glass towers, now shattered like bone, and scattered across the plains of what used to be hope. And he found shelter in a temple, or what remained of one, and laid her down upon an altar of stone and dust, and whispered apologies to whatever gods she might have had, as he worked to clean her wounds with the last of his water and the rags from his sleeves. And she stirred only once and flinched when his fingers brushed the brand on her shoulder, the mark of a traitor burned into her by her own counsel for daring to end the war with peace. And he understood now why they had tried to kill her, why she had fled, and why she had fallen. And yet she had survived because of something deep within her, something that matched the same fire he had once felt when he signed up to fight for Earth. She woke with a gasp, like a drowning soul tasting air for the first time, and her eyes locked on his as if she remembered him from another life, and for a moment he thought she would scream or strike or command, but instead she said thank you, in a voice soft as dust, and it shook him more than any explosion could have. And he asked her name, and she gave it not as a queen, but as a woman alone and bleeding and afraid. And that was when he stopped thinking of her as the enemy, and started seeing her as a person. And they spoke not as human and alien, not as soldier and sovereign, but as two survivors of something too large and cruel to understand. And in the silence that followed their words, he fed her what little he had, and held her when she trembled, and promised her that he would get her to safety, even if it meant walking through hell again. They left the ruins beneath a sky of stormlight and broken moons. And each step forward was a gamble with fate, and with every ridge they crossed, they drew closer to the extraction point, where a neutral medevac ship waited for the wounded of both sides. And it was meant to be impartial, but he had seen what happened to enemies disguised as friends, and he knew they would kill her if they knew who she was. So he disguised her as best he could in his old uniform, and told her not to speak, and she nodded her understanding. But he could see the pain in her eyes, the pride she swallowed, and he hated that he had to ask her to hide. And as they approached the checkpoint, a drone swept down and scanned them, and he thought it was the end until the machine chirped and flew off, and she let out a breath that sounded like a sob, and he squeezed her hand and said they were almost free, though he did not believe it. They made it within sight of the dropship before the alarms went off, before the Veirathi assassins sent to finish the job spotted them from the hills and opened fire, and he dropped to his knees with her in his arms, and rolled behind a fallen engine block. and returned fire with a rifle he had stolen 3 days ago. And she reached for a sidearm despite the pain, and fought beside him. And he realized she was no helpless royal. She was fire and steel and fury. And together they drove the attackers back until the last one fell. And then she collapsed again, and he caught her before she hit the ground, and ran again, through smoke and fire and screaming engines toward the open hatch of the evac ship. And the medic tried to stop him, but he roared that she was his wife, his wounded wife, and the lie was so real in his heart that it burned, and they let him pass, and the doors closed behind them. The stars looked cold from the window of the medbay, and he sat beside her, as the machines worked to mend her body, and every beep of the monitor was a promise that she would live. And when her eyes opened again, she smiled. And it was not the smile of a queen. It was the smile of someone who had seen death and chosen to stay for someone else. And she asked him again if he had meant it when he said she was his wife, and he wanted to laugh, but he nodded instead, and said yes, because in that moment he realized he had never meant anything more in his life. And she reached for his hand and held it with fingers that still trembled, and he whispered her name, not as a title, but as a vow. And they sat in silence as the ship drifted above the broken world they had both once fought for, and no one came to take her away, because in the end, there was no one left to command her but herself. They offered her a throne again once her survival became known. They sent emissaries and envoys and pleas from the fractured remnants of her people, who begged her to lead them once more, and she listened to them all with quiet patience. And when they were done, she said no, not because she had forgotten them, but because she remembered too much. She remembered the pain, the betrayal, the silence of the council as they sentenced her to death for choosing peace, and she said she would not wear a crown that cost so many lives. And when they asked where she would go, she turned to him and said, "Wherever he goes, I go." And in that moment, he knew the war was over, at least for them, because she had chosen love over duty, and he had chosen her over everything else. And as they walked away together, no longer soldier and queen, but something new, something whole, the galaxy kept spinning, aware of the peace that had just begun. They settled on a small planet at the edge of the map systems, where no one cared who they had been, and no one asked what banners they had once fought under. And in time, the scar on her side faded and the lines on his face softened, and he built a house with his own hands, and she planted stars in the garden with seeds from her homeworld. And every night they watched the skies together and spoke of dreams instead of memories. And when she looked at him now, it was not with duty or desperation, but with quiet joy. And every time she said the word husband, he felt the world tilt a little more into place. And when he called her beloved, she smiled like the first sunrise. And they did not need crowns or medals or stories, because they had each other. And in a galaxy that had torn itself apart, that was the only victory that mattered.